Welcome to Shelterhouse Shares on MCTV. We at Shelterhouse are so proud to be able to bring you this information about who we are and what we do. And today I have with me Kim Bruce, and she is our Director of Programs and Client Services. Kim, you want to talk a little bit about yourself and your background?
Sure. I'm a social worker by training, and I've worked at Shelterhouse for 11 years and have loved almost every minute.
Oh, that's wonderful. So we're here today to talk about trauma-informed services. So we want to start with the basics. What is trauma?
Trauma is a situation where somebody is completely overwhelmed by emotion, by intense fear, horror, helplessness. Really, their coping is completely overwhelmed because of the intensity of a situation or situations that they've been through.
And that applies to domestic violence and sexual assault.
Absolutely.
Very well.
Yep. They are definitely examples of trauma.
Okay. Well, what, like domestic violence, might be not just one incident. It frequently happens
Right.
over several days, weeks, months, years.
Mm-hmm.
And the buildup of trauma has to be horrific for people.
It absolutely is. Sexual assault also, whether it's one incident or many, trauma is what's happening, and the aftermath of trauma is what we see day in and day out in our work at Shelterhouse.
So knowing all of that, why is it important to use a trauma-informed approach for services at Shelterhouse?
Well, we've learned that trauma actually changes the structure of the brain. So the brain is changed, and traditional mental health approaches and mental health counseling doesn't address what needs to be addressed. We need a more holistic approach.
To help heal that brain.
Exactly.
Yeah. So tell me more about the trauma-informed services at Shelterhouse. What do they look like?
Well, really it begins with the crisis call. We see things that we know are trauma effects when people call us. For example, maybe they're very scattered. Maybe they're very overwhelmed with emotion. Maybe they're focused on one detail and we can't quite understand why they're thinking that way. But we're trained to ask ourselves, not what's wrong with that person, but what's happened to that person? What kind of trauma have they gone through? So all of our staff and volunteers that answer the phones are trained to understand trauma and think of things in terms of trauma. We also have things set up in our shelter that we try to make it very safe and welcoming.
So safety is very important.
Exactly. We've learned that there's no more important intervention for trauma than a safe relationship. And for us, that also includes a safe place. So we set up our building to just feel safe as far as physical safety, but also emotional safety. So things are confidential, things are warm and welcoming, and all of this is really to help people who've experienced trauma.
Okay, safety is important. We set the facility up to address trauma, but exactly how do you do the work and address safety with the people that we serve at Shelterhouse?
Well, we do different things depending on the person's age because we work with all ages at Shelterhouse. For adults, we look at their daily lives and think through where they're at risk. Generally, people aren't at risk when they're at Shelterhouse. Mm-hmm. It's their outside lives from Shelterhouse, their homes, their workplaces, their relationships that can be unsafe. So we talk through all of that. And we've just gathered a lot of safety ideas from talking to survivors and finding out what works from people that have gone through these things. We can help people get personal protection orders, that type of thing, if that's a part of what they need. We even are able to sometimes give somebody a cell phone for safety. So there are very practical things we do for safety. With children, we focus on helping them learn their phone number, full name, address, parents' full name, and we practice those things. We even have some games that we use to teach children these things. And we include the parent in that safety training so that they know what the child is learning and they can practice those same skills at home. For youth of all ages, we talk about safe people, safe places, and really think through in their lives where they need to know these things and who they can go to if they're having any issues with safety.
Okay, so about safety, and we've talked about safety with adults, and it might include a cell phone, it might, a safe place to be, whatever. Mm-hmm. Can you give me an example. Say I'm a woman who works and I need to go to work, and I know that my batterer knows where I work, knows how to get a hold of me. What are some things that I might do to be safe?
Sure.
Like going from shelter to work or going from
Exactly.
home to work.
Yeah, one thing we do talk about is always having a cell phone, at least a cell phone that can call 911. In addition, if the person's comfortable or willing to consider it, we ask them to tell people at work that need to know and can really help them enhance their safety. Depending on where that is, it could be security where they work, a supervisor, a coworker. Walking in and out of the building with somebody can be that's a simple thing, but that can make them safer. So those kinds of practical things we're talking about.
Very practical, not going out and have to buy some huge safety or alarm system for the home. You're not talking about that. You're talking about simple, practical things.
Exactly.
Okay. What about kids? What if their fear goes really deep?
Yeah, well, that I think would be trauma, and we work with kids actively. We have master's level therapists that work with children who've gone through trauma, and they're actually trained in a trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, which is the best practice for working with kids who've been through sexual assault or domestic violence.
So doing that referral. So it's beyond just a simple advocacy, which is never simple, I understand that, but it's getting that next step to get the counseling that's a fit for what their needs
Exactly, yep.
Okay. So what else do people who've experienced trauma need? We've talked about safety. What else?
Sure. One important thing is self-care. Usually if somebody's been in an abusive relationship or been sexually assaulted, it is very difficult to sleep, to eat, to even get out of bed sometimes. So we work with just how they can take care of themselves. Something as simple as helping sleep get regulated can really have a big impact on somebody's coping. So we're talking about those practical things. We also know that people who've been through trauma really benefit from a routine, from consistency, from kind of a planned day. And so we encourage people, once again, that's not rocket science, but when your brain has been altered by trauma, knowing what's going to happen in your day and having a plan and having that consistency can be very, very helpful. We also know that open and respectful communication, safe relationships are healing for trauma victims. So we really work to offer that at Shelterhouse and be a place where that can happen, maybe for the first time in a long time for somebody.
Safe relationships, not only with their worker, but I imagine with family, friends.
Exactly. Talking about who's safe, knowing, being educated about red flags, and really being able to know who they can go to and really get what they need and who they need to keep their guard up a little bit. One more thing that we have offered that's kind of different is a yoga class, because yoga is healing for the brain and the body when somebody's gone through a trauma. So right now we're able to have a free yoga class for our clients, and we're really thrilled with that because we know that's kind of a cutting edge practice to help people who've been through a difficult situation like this.
So many people who haven't experienced trauma go to yoga on a regular basis and they feel better. But a person who's experienced trauma, it's even more beneficial.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
So how do you talk to survivors about trauma?
Well, one thing we've noticed is just giving them this language has a healing quality. They don't perhaps know that what they've been through is trauma, and they're experiencing the aftermath of trauma. So by using that word and talking about the traumatic effects and that their brain is actually changed, that helps them understand feelings they have, which might include, I'm going crazy, why can't I remember anything? I'm losing my mind. These are things that kind of escalate and cause them to really doubt themselves, really worry about themselves, and when they know this is trauma, you've been through a trauma, this is expected, it can be kind of an aha moment. So we have those conversations.
So the person who's confused, can't remember, do all of those things, sometimes we hear people say that those are the very things. So having experienced the trauma, it's a symptom, a result of the trauma, and we've also heard people say that their batterer used that against them to demean them and to make them feel small.
That can be part of the emotional abuse. She begins to feel crazy, and he tells her, "You're crazy, no one will believe you." And so it's just a, very effective way to emotionally abuse somebody or control somebody, is to kind of highlight these trauma symptoms, which are totally normal for someone to experience.
So to hear that from a shelter house employee, someone who's a professional in the field, and validate that you're not going crazy, this is just a result of what you've been through,
Exactly.
is very reassuring.
Right, right. We also ask people how they've changed because of the trauma. So that allows them to see maybe once they weren't having these symptoms and now they are, and that it is a cause and effect. We ask about their kids coping too.
Okay. So let's talk about children and trauma. What are we seeing as we work to help kids?
We see kids that have been through very scary, overwhelming, and painful situations. And that's the definition of trauma right there. So Shelterhouse works with children both that have had domestic violence in their families or who've been sexually assaulted. Those are our two areas of our mission. We know that trauma can affect a child's development. So that's the main thing we look at with kids, is the impact on development. For real young kids, that might look like regression with potty training or with thumb sucking, or maybe they've outgrown a behavior and they go back to it and it's somehow comforting to them.
Okay. What about older kids?
Older kids, sleep also becomes an issue, just like we've talked about with adults. Sometimes they are having nightmares, night terrors, don't want to be alone, very clingy with adults. There can kind of be two extremes with kids. One is the child who becomes very withdrawn, and the other is the child that acts out dramatically. Both of those things can be signs of trauma. Teens may also feel crazy. They may have that same symptom that we just talked about with adults, be irritable, have trouble sleeping. They may act out in some high-risk ways, and the risks that teens can take are often more dangerous than younger kids,
Sure.
So it really can have a bigger impact on their lives.
Okay. So how does trauma affect family and friends? We've talked about the victims. Well, what
Right.
about family and friends of the people who've experienced the trauma?
Yeah, this is called secondary trauma, and it can be significant. We've worked with family members who have some of these same symptoms just from knowing what for example, their adult child is going through, or maybe a grandchild who's been sexually assaulted. Knowing that, knowing some of those details, knowing of that story can result in secondary trauma, which is some of these same symptoms, and some of the same interventions can be helpful. We also, of course, our staff, we need to work and watch for the issue of secondary trauma, because it's a byproduct of the work we do every day.
Sure. So can you share some information about how we address secondary trauma?
Sure. Once again, self-care is very important. And we talk about that with families that we work with who are experiencing it, and really as staff, we're growing to be more and more focused on this, because we know to keep our services happening and to be able to provide these important services, we have got to take great care of ourselves so we're fresh and ready to do this work. So at Shelterhouse, we do things like try to weave fun into our days. We have retreats that we go on. We have a star employee. We make sure we have fun together at every staff meeting, and we just offer a lot of support. We really encourage staff to talk to each other for support, knowing that that is going to keep us going and able to do our important work.
So secondary trauma is serious stuff.
Yeah, it's really...
And anyone who experiences it needs to understand that it needs to be addressed. I know that there's a book, Trauma Stewardship, that talks about secondary trauma and how to do that self-care,
Right.
and so that might be a resource for some people.
Yep, several of our staff have read that book and really begun to use some of the ideas in it to take care of ourselves and to help the families of the people that we're working with take care of themselves.
Okay, so is there anything else you'd like to share?
I guess I'd just like to mention that our services are tailored to the individual's need. We offer all kinds of services, and we're really willing to think of and do something different than we've ever done before to help an individual survivor. We go to court with people. We go to lots of different kinds of appointments with them. We have master's level therapy available for those who